Have you ever watched a documentary on history of slavery and wondered how millions of people could be turned into property? Not prisoners of war, not criminals, property. Human beings bought, sold, transported across oceans, and forced to build entire economies. The slave trade in Africa history became one of the largest forced migrations in human history. But to understand how this happened, we have to start with a surprising truth. Slavery did not begin in Africa, and it did not begin in the Americas. In fact, it is almost as old as civilization itself. Chapter 1: Slavery before the Atlantic World. Long before the Atlantic slave trade, slavery existed in nearly every major civilization. In ancient Egypt, enslaved workers labored in agriculture, construction, and domestic service. In Greece, slavery was woven into everyday life. Even societies that celebrated democracy relied heavily on enslaved labor. Rome pushed the system even further. After major military victories, entire populations were sometimes enslaved and forced to work on farms, mines, and construction projects. Across the ancient world, slavery was brutal, but it usually had different characteristics from what would later emerge in the Atlantic world. Many enslaved people were prisoners of war or individuals forced into labor through debt. In some cases, enslaved people could gain freedom or eventually become part of society. Another surprising detail comes from the word slave itself. The term originates from the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, many of whom were captured and enslaved during the medieval conflict. Long before Africa became associated with global slave trading networks, Europeans themselves were being enslaved in large numbers. Slavery also existed within Africa before European traders arrived. In many African societies, enslaved individuals were often prisoners of war or people absorbed into household as servants or laborers. These systems varied widely. In some places, enslaved people could marry into families or eventually gain freedom. But the system that would emerge across the Atlantic was something very different. It was not built mainly on war or a societal hierarchy. It was built on profit. Chapter 2: Indigenous enslavement in the Americas. When the Europeans first arrived in the Americas in the late 1400s, they immediately saw the economic potential of the land. Gold, sugar, and agricultural wealth promised enormous profits. But there was one major obstacle: labor. Colonial plantations and mines required huge numbers of workers. At first, Europeans forced indigenous populations into labor systems such as the encomienda. Indigenous communities were compelled to work for colonial authorities, often under brutal conditions. But disease and exploitation devastated these populations. In some regions, indigenous populations declined by as much as 90% within a century. With the local populations collapsing, European traders began searching for new sources of labor. Their attention turned toward the west coast of Africa, and this decision would transform world history. Chapter 3: The rise of the transatlantic slave trade. By the 15th century, Portuguese explorers had begun sailing along the African coastline. At first, They were searching for gold and trade routes, but they soon discovered something that would reshape global commerce. Human beings could be bought and sold on a massive scale. The European traders began purchasing captives through regional trading networks and transporting them to the colonies in the Americas. Over time, this trade expanded dramatically. Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands all became deeply involved. The result was a vast commercial system known as the triangular trade. Ships left Europe carrying manufactured goods such as textiles, weapons, and alcohol. These goods were traded in Africa for captives. The captives were then transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. Finally, plantation products like sugar, tobacco, and cotton were shipped back to Europe. At the center of this system was something known as chattel slavery. Under chattel slavery, human beings were legally defined as property. They had no legal rights, no recognized identity. Families could be separated, children sold, and individuals treated like livestock. This system transformed slavery into a large-scale commercial enterprise. Chapter 4. The Middle Passage. Captured Africans were marched to coastal forts along the West African shoreline. Inside these forts were underground chambers where hundreds of captives could be confined for weeks. From there, they were forced onto ships bound for the Americas. The journey across the Atlantic became known as the Middle Passage. Conditions on these ships were horrific. Hundreds of people were packed tightly together in dark holds. Food and water were limited. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Disease spread quickly through the crowded spaces. Historians estimate that millions of people died during these voyages. Some ships lost up to 20% of those on board before reaching land. But even in these conditions, resistance continued. Some captives organized revolts and attempted to take control of the ships. Others refused food or chose death over enslavement. The Middle Passage became one of the most brutal journeys in human history. Chapter 5. Life under slavery. For those who survived the Atlantic crossing, the reality awaiting them in the Americas was harsh and unforgiving. Enslaved Africans were sold at auctions. Buyers inspected them like livestock. Families were often separated immediately. Plantations demanded relentless labor. Enslaved people worked long hours growing crops such as sugar, cotton, rice, and tobacco. Punishments were severe. Whippings and physical violence were used to maintain control. But even under these conditions, enslaved communities found ways to preserve their humanity. They maintained cultural traditions through music, storytelling, and spiritual practices. African rhythms and songs blended with new experiences in the Americas, shaping cultural traditions that still exist today. Resistance also took many forms. Some enslaved people sabotaged equipment or slowed production. Others escaped plantations and formed independent communities known as maroon societies, and sometimes resistance erupted into open rebellion. Chapter 6. Revolutions and Personal Stories. One of the most powerful revolts in history began in 1791 on the Caribbean island of Saint Dominic. Enslaved people rose up against French colonial rule and led by revolutionary figures such as Toussaint Louverture. The uprising transformed into a full revolution. After years of fighting, enslaved forces defeated European armies. The colony became the independent nation of Haiti, the first black republic in a modern world. Personal stories also played a major role in exposing the brutality of slavery. Oluda Equino, who had been kidnapped as a child and survived the Middle Passage, later wrote a powerful autobiography describing his experiences. Another important voice was Mary Prince, whose narrative revealed the daily cruelty faced by enslaved women. These accounts helped awaken public awareness and strengthen the growing abolitionist movement. Chapter 7: Abolition and Legal Freedom. By the late 18th century, abolition movements were gaining momentum. Activists began challenging the contradiction between ideals of freedom and the reality of slavery. In Britain, campaigns led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. Slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1833. In the United States, tensions over slavery eventually led to the Civil War. After the war, a series of constitutional amendments reshaped the legal framework of the nation. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship. The 15th Amendment protected voting rights for black men. Legal slavery had ended, but the legacy of the system would continue to shape societies long afterward. Chapter 8: The Legacy of Slavery. The history of slavery left deep marks on the modern world. Economic systems, racial hierarchies, and social inequalities were shaped by centuries of forced labor. For many descendants of enslaved people, modern DNA technology has helped reconnect families separated by the slave trade. Yet, one uncomfortable truth remains: slavery did not fully disappear. Today, millions of people around the world are trapped in forms of modern slavery, including forced labor, human trafficking, and exploitation. Historians estimate that more than 40 million people still live in conditions resembling slavery. The forms have changed, but the struggle against exploitation continues. The slave trade in Africa history reshaped continents, built powerful economies, and changed the course of global history. Understanding the history of slavery is not simply about remembering the past. It is about recognizing how the world we live in today was shaped, and why the fight for human freedom remains unfinished.